I'm so excited to be here. I want to thank the Richmond Memorial Health Foundation's Board of Trustees for the invitation. I had the opportunity to have a great conversation about the work of the foundation and its future direction. I should thank Chris and Reggie. And Reggie was telling me that he watched the movies in here, and I'm a huge movie fan. And the idea of watching films in here as a kid, wow. And the council for the welcome. And of course, I just want to really call out Mark and his team for both the invitation and for leading in this work. And it's one of the things I shared with trustees. I just want to share with you all. As you're embarking on this journey and talking about and leading with equity, that y'all really are leading the way in the country. And as Mark named, I deeply believe we're in a hard time as a country. And I deeply believe the only way that we're getting out of that is by getting real about what it means to have this conversation of centering issues of equity and race, the hard conversations, locally in our communities, and coming up with solutions that allow us to transcend that national noise. So I just want to say thank you for having me, and I'm really genuinely excited about the work. I get to hang out with the 18 Health Equity Fellows tomorrow, but if you're a Health Equity Fellow, will you raise your hand? Right on. And if you're an artist, will you raise your hand? I know there's a few closet artists in this room. Yeah? Both of those pieces, I think, are so essential that if we want to get real about changing the dialogue that we have around issues of race and equity, we, got to give people the skills, resources they need to be able to do that in their communities, in thinking and to support leadership in doing that, thinking about the Health Equity Fellows. And B, we've got to find new ways of having this conversation. And that is essential that we lead with arts and culture and thinking about how we do that. So with that, let me jump in. So I think what I need is a clicker. You all know this, but it is worth naming. There is, it doesn't matter what social, economic, life indicator you look at, race is a predictor of success. Part of the reason that at the Center for Social Inclusion we focus on race is not because we believe it's the only issue that matters. We believe that actually we're not getting to the communities we have unless we figure out gender, unless we figure out class. But we believe that it's the one that if we can't figure out how to talk about, that we'll never be able to address those other issues. It's the gateway drug to better conversations. This fact, that it doesn't matter what you look at, and you put a little bit of race on it, and it dictates whether or not people succeed, is a core reason why we think about doing this work. It turns out the Ferguson report, folks, anybody else in here read the Ferguson report? Few people. So when the Ferguson report came out, it's kind of a dense document, but it's a great piece on looking at issues like police accountability, talking about the role of government and how that intersects around issues of race. But the number in the Ferguson report that's most powerful is that the difference in life expectancy based on race, based on zip code, because we all know zip code and race are just euphemisms in the United States, right? The difference in life expectancy in Ferguson is 30 years, 30, right? Full lifetime. And that's not just about policing, right? That is about the collective failure of our institutions in actually supporting people in getting to different outcomes. So, and why does that matter? Besides the fact that morally we should all be shocked that our neighbor could be living literally 30 years less than us. It also matters in just a deep pragmatic sense, because soon our neighbors who are actually living a life 30 years shorter than us are going to be the majority of people in our country, right? By 2040, we will no longer have a single majority. And the folks who are facing the greatest numbers of these types of inequities, people of color, immigrants, refugees, will become the majority in our communities. We literally are heading in a direction that is not tenable economically or socially. Can't work. Folks with me? The numbers do not add up. So whether we're talking about this in pragmatic terms, like how do we make sure that we all have a successful, thriving community in the next 40 years, or whether we're talking about this in moral terms, which is how can we collectively sit by and watch our neighbors suffer, this is the core question that we need to be answering in the country we believe in this moment. Oh, it's jumping ahead. Kind of magic. I like to always share a little bit about myself, so let me say this really quick. My mom and dad, why I do this work. My dad just passed away this last year. This picture, this is a year after they got married. The large-headed child in the middle is my brother. I mean, every time I see this picture, I'm like, I had to deal with that 17 years with that face coming at me. You know what I mean? He is full of energy. But I share this because when they got married in late 50s. It was still illegal in most states in the United States. And they have had such a deep influence in who I am and how I think about the world. And so my dad was born and raised in Tuskegee, Alabama. Yeah, Tuskegee. And that was my dad. He'd have been hooting and hollering right now. He's an old-fashioned race man in that classic way, you know, and deeply proud of his heritage, deeply proud of who he was. And he joined the military. One of the things he was not deeply happy with was living in the South. So at the age of 17, he joined the military, and he never set foot in the South again until the day he died. He was in the military. He met my mom, and she's from Scotland, from Edinburgh. He was stationed there. They met. They fell in love. That story. My mom comes from a long line of labor activists. And so growing up, like breakfast, lunch, and dinner was race, class, race, class, race, class. Endless. So I always say I came by this work fairly honestly. And so very early on, I had a pretty good handle on what racism was, right? And then when I was, I guess I must have been 15, we got a letter in the mail. It was an apology letter from the president and a check for $27 and some odd cents. And our great Uncle James, my great Uncle James, my father's Uncle James, had been part of the Tuskegee syphilis experiments. Folks know, raise your hand if you know what the Tuskegee syphilis experiments are. Almost everybody. 50-year project, right? 600 black men. Federal government says we're going to treat you for syphilis and give you free health care. In fact, the point of it was to track the long-term effects of syphilis to the point of death. And if you know anything about syphilis, it is a slow, horrific way to die. And so even at 15, like I understood people could be bad. Like people could hate each other. People could be mean-spirited. But I could not wrap my head around this one, right? I mean, you got the federal government. You've got the state of Alabama. You've got Macon County. You've got even Tuskegee Institute itself. You've got thousands of people over a 50-year period of time watching people die a slow, horrific death. And it wasn't until 1972 that one person, whistleblower, stood up and said, this is wrong. Right? And the piece that has motivated me all this time, I mean it, is I know that in a system of that many people, that not every one of those people could just be dastardly human beings. You with me? Like 5 or 6 people getting together and say, we're going to do something really evil and mean? Yep, seen it. No, that happens. Thousands of people getting together and no, there's something else at play. So how is it? How is it that people can participate in a system that results in such horrific outcomes? And I put that out to say, because I deeply believe that 100 years from now, people will look back at us and ask the same question. You with me? So do this with me. Think of a number between 1 and 10. Don't tell anybody. It's your number. Got it? Multiply that number times 9. Take your time on this part. Got your number? If it's a 2-digit number, add them together. So for example, if you ended up with like 32, you would add it together. 3 plus 2 equals 5. You want to come back to a single digit. Got it? Subtract 5 from that. Minus 5. Got your number? Okay. I want you to turn that number into a letter. So A would be 1, B would be 2. You with me? Got your letter? Now I want you to think of a country that starts with that letter. This goes on for a long time, so stay with me. Doesn't, I promise. Think of I love the idea that like an hour from now we're still going, you know what I mean? It's a country that starts with that letter. You got it? Last letter in your country's name, think of an animal that starts with that letter. Got it? This is the last one. Last letter in your animal's name, think of a fruit that starts with that letter. You good? Okay, so how many folks are thinking about kangaroos in Denmark eating oranges? Who got Denmark kangaroo orange? Raise your hand up so people can see. So this one so how did that work? We're going to keep this interactive, so talk to me. How did that work? 5. Yes, it's the math. The math was a distraction. It was really, if you did not start with the letter D, you got your math wrong. I'm just letting you know. The math is set up to always get you back to the number 4, which means you should have started with the letter D. So it's just a distraction. But hold this, it's a distraction like so many things in our daily lives, right? So the real question was really one question, which was, what country starts with the letter D, right? So the piece that's worth noting on this, hold this with me, that in the United States, when you ask this, 70–90% of people, 70 to 90%, say Denmark kangaroo orange. So how many countries start with the letter D? Anybody get anything besides Denmark? Dominican Republic. Thank you. If we were sitting right now in the Caribbean and I said, hey, what country starts with the letter D? It'd be good if we were sitting right now in the Caribbean, I'm going to say that. But Dominican, right? Dominican Republic, Dominica might come up. My personal favorite is Djibouti in Central Northern Africa. Yeah? So there's 4 different. We know there's a little bit of bias at play there. What animals start with the letter K? Koala. Kangaroo, kiwi bird, kingfish, there's dozens. Literally dozens. What fruit start with the letter O? I had to Google this. Olive is a fruit. Turns out there's at least 6. So hold this with me. 70 to 90% of us say Denmark kangaroo orange to a set of questions that have over 1 million possible answers. You with me? Over 1 million possibilities, and 70 to 90% of us say the exact same thing. Because even when we think we're starting with our own ideas, there is a whole set of history, culture, institutional practice, and structure that's driving all of us endlessly to the same outcome, again and again and again. And so when we look around and we're like, how is it possible that 60 years after the civil rights movement, these are our educational outcomes, these are our health outcomes? Denmark kangaroo orange. Guarantee you tomorrow someone will wake up and say, I have a brand new idea on how to fix this. Denmark kangaroo orange. You with me? So the central question is, what do we do to interrupt that? How do we actually get to a million possibilities rather than one? Does that make sense to folks? So CSI, I'm gonna make this really quick. We work nationally. We're based out of New York. We work in 30 states. And the core of our work is really these four things. Policy development, do a lot of work around issues of health, built environment, sort of equitable development work, and environmental justice work. We do work around communications and narrative. We believe that we have to figure out ways to normalize conversation around race, and we've got to be more effective in talking about equity and how we frame it. We do a lot of field building work, and all we mean there is leadership development. People need skills, right? To be clear, named this earlier, do this again for me. Raise your hand if you believe in racial equity. Raise your hand if you care about racial equity. I can tell you, promise you, done this across the country, I don't care what room you're in, the overwhelming majority of people will raise their hand to that. 90% across the board. And we could all sit around and be like, yeah, but half of them aren't serious, right? But I would actually really put forward to you that the gap that we see in our communities is not a values gap. It's a practice gap. It's not that people don't care, they don't know what to do. And we're going to come back to that. So giving people those skills is essential. Finally, institutional change. We do a lot of work in thinking about how do we transform our institutions to actually really put equity into operation. And we have a program that's called the Government Alliance on Race and Equity. And we work with about 150 government jurisdictions from across the country, really helping them really think about what does it mean to put that into practice, to operationalize that work. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that as we sort of go along here. But this is our central frame, just to name. What we've seen as being really helpful in organizations, institutions, and community thinking about how do we get to different outcomes is these three buckets, if you will. That we need to figure out how we normalize conversations around race and equity. We need to do that with a sense of urgency. We need to organize, and we mean that both in terms of within our organizations, we need to actually bring people together, but we also need to build infrastructure that allows us to do that, build relationships. For example, great example would be the health equity fellows. We've got to create systems that allow us to work together and have these conversations. And then finally, to operationalize this work, we need tools to help us do that, and we've got to measure and track our outcomes. And all of that sits, of course, within a vision. And that vision has to be created by the community that we sit in. And it's got to be driven by those who are most impacted by these outcomes. So I'm going to very quickly walk us through normalize, organize, and operationalize. And then we're going to open it up and have some Q&A and answer some questions and hopefully just have a good, juicy dialogue. So normalize. How do we actually get to a different conversation? My favorite survey of all time, this was a question, are you comfortable in talking about race? 90% of people said, yes. I'm so good. 90%. Follow-up question, is your neighbor comfortable in talking about race? 90%, no. Right? And that is the nature of our conversation on race in the United States. I'm all good if you could figure out how to deal with it, right? Figuring out how we actually get past that is absolutely essential. And one of the things we have to do is we've got to define our terms. And one of the things that the foundation has been doing is really centering this question. What is the terms we're using? What do we mean by them? And it's essential. It's not that we all have to be in agreement, but we have to be in agreement about what we're talking about to even get to a meaningful set of disagreements, right? So, difference between equity and equality, I'm going to give you my example. It's one of my favorites. So everybody here has been to a sporting event or a major show, maybe in a space like this. And like halftime comes or intermission, and everyone files out and heads to where? Say it again. Bathroom. You got it. So answer me this question. What's the difference in the experience for men and women in that? I always love, that was a great laugh. What's the difference? Tell me. Yeah, what's the difference? The number of facilities in a room, the wait, right? For women in a room, how much longer do you think you wait than men? 3 times, 4 times. You notice it'll turn into a bidding war in a second. That's right. But clearly, significantly, right? Number of restrooms in those facilities for men versus women. Same. That is equality. You with me? Half of us are men, half of us are women. Therefore, half the restrooms are for men, half the restrooms for women. But for all the reasons that folks started to name, who designed restrooms, how women use restrooms versus how men use restrooms, for all those reasons, the outcomes are radically different. And so the question about equity is just looking at a system that's out of balance and applying a little bit of common sense and a little bit of justice to it, right? So this conversation in the last decade, what happened is you had a lot of architects who were starting to do, but like, hey, why don't we just build like 1.5 women's restrooms for every 1 man? So there's a lot of, stadiums, et cetera, around the country where you would go in and you'll see that. There's now, they're not exactly the same. But it's even taken further. Some folks were like, why do we actually have gendered restrooms? It's become a profound set of discussions for us as a nation. And why, even in that way, why can't we just have family-style restrooms, right? And you see that in almost every airport in the United States now, right? There's a place where somebody can take their child in, do a change, but it means anybody could use it, right? So the idea of equity, a little bit of justice, a little bit of common sense to a system that's out of balance. But the reason that I like it, as an example, is for the men in the room, what are we doing while women are waiting to get into the restroom? Talking about them, having a beer, but what are we really doing? We're waiting. With me? We're waiting on our partners, we're waiting on our daughters, we're waiting on our mothers, we're waiting on our friends. We're waiting. We may be talking about them. We may be having a beer while we're doing it. The only difference is we're not standing in a line. We're still waiting. Because when a system's out of balance, it's not working for anybody. It's just some of us are paying a higher cost for it. You with me? So the idea is, a really simple one, if women get through restrooms faster, men get through restrooms faster. Right? So again, that's equity. It's not only coming up with thinking about those who are most impacted and coming up with a solution that works for them. It's recognizing that in doing so, we come up with solutions that work better for us collectively. It's really, in that way, a critical distinction between how we're trying to name equity and equality. So here's a definition of racial equity. Just one. Racial equity is when race no longer is a determinant of life outcomes, and 2, in addressing racial inequity directly, we improve outcomes for everyone, including white people. Racial equity is both our process and the outcome we seek to achieve. It is an inclusive approach to transform structures towards access, justice, self-determination, redistribution, and sharing of power and resources. It says a lot. but it starts to name some of the things that we're actually trying to wrestle with, right? So want to just name that one of the things that happens when we get in this conversation in defining our terms is that we dumb down our conversation on issues of race and equity. So in the United States, we find it really helpful that if we start to parse what it is that we're really naming. So in the United States, when we talk about race, overwhelmingly people think about individual racism. Folks with me? So prejudgment, bias, discrimination by an individual based on race. There's also institutional racism, which is policies, practices, and procedures that work better for white people than for people of color, regardless of intention, right? And then there's structural racism, which is a history and current reality of institutional racism across all those institutions that combines to create a system of inequities based on race. Name this because in the United States, when we say racism, people want to talk about individual bias. And it's really important that we're able to actually have a conversation about what those distinctions mean, because in fact, the solutions to them are radically different, right? It turns out that things like anti-discrimination law are pretty effective at addressing individual bias. Doesn't make it go away, but it gives you a remedy. It turns out that those same practices are not very helpful with institutional bias, with institutional racism. So us being really clear about what it is that we're trying to address, critical. Easiest way to think about this, to wrap this up on the normalizing, is that everybody in this room has a bias. If you act on it, you are discriminating, right? This beautiful institution is run by a set of policy and practice. And that policy and practice is either moving us collectively towards equity or away from it. It's only two directions. And if we pan back from the theater and took in the skyline of Richmond, it is the interaction of all of those institutions that are determining who wins and who loses. Folks with me? So as we think about our solutions for each of those, they shift, they change. So how do we actually get to change? We name this. One thing is we have to organize. I promise you I'm not going to walk you through that. That is a hot mess of a slide. But it is to name that this is looking at government, that if we are serious about wanting to put our change into practice, that we need to get real about how things are done. And so this actually shows that from leadership to staff, folks have to be engaged. It actually shows that you have to think about having a plan. You have to actually think about building it into things like performance reviews. That you actually need to have tools to be able to apply it in real life. I will sum this up by saying this. Mark mentioned Seattle and the Race and Social Justice Initiative. The Race and Social Justice Initiative is going into its 13th year in Seattle. It's going into its 13th year not just because every elected official in Seattle has endorsed it. Didn't start that way. It's going into its 13th year because every month in Seattle, there are 30 meetings in the city on race and equity. Every month, and it's been happening for 13 years. Every department's having the conversation, every issue-based grouping is having the conversation. If you want to know what your organization or the institutions you work with care about, find out what they're meeting on. It's a weird measurement, but it's a central one in how our organizations and institutions function. We do that because actually we're trying to change organizations. We actually want organizations to have this as a practice, not just simply a set of like, here's our value statement or here's the one policy that we're changing, but a way of thinking about how we do business. And so part of the work with government, and we've been doing this with multiple jurisdictions around the country, is actually tracking how employees are thinking about applying these ideas. City of Seattle, 10,000 city employees. Voluntary survey, 50 questions. What do you think about race? What do you think about equity? How do you think your department is doing? How do you think this work is happening for the city as a whole? Those kinds of questions. Voluntary, 50 questions, send it out. 5,000 employees respond every 2 years. People care. This is not a values question, it is a practice question. And this is from 2012 survey, the last survey I was involved with. 86% believe that looking at the impact and issues of race in their job is what we should be doing. 86%, right? 66% was saying, I'm trying to figure out how to do this in my daily job. And that for us was our measurement of a tipping point for when things change. Not just when leadership says we care about these issues, but when people in their daily jobs can say, I'm actually trying to figure out how to make this work. So what does it mean to operationalize this work? And what I'm going to do is just give you one example. It is to name that, in fact, what we're really trying to do in this way is get people, in this example, to think about tools and measurement. And so we're just naming that an equity tool is both a process and a product. And I'm going to give you an example, and we're going to wrap it up. It's a great example about public safety, about health, and about what it means for us to have a thriving communities. So streetlights. If I were to say to you, streetlights is the quintessential racial justice issue, you might be a little confused. I was. But it turns out that we sometimes are not recognizing that the impacts on our community are compound impacts, right? It's like going back to Ferguson. Like, yes, what police are doing is essential, but that is not what's driving that 30-year difference in life expectancy. So in Seattle, we had a spate of shootings in about 8 years ago now, and had 5 young men of color die within 3 months, which was high rate in Seattle. I think the oldest was 17. And so the mayor was very concerned and did a classic mayor move where he was like, we're going to go tour the neighborhood. So he loaded a van full of like city employees, and we're driving down Southeast Seattle, which is, Seattle's a very white city, but Southeast Seattle, interesting factoid, Southeast Seattle was the most diverse zip code for almost 20 years in the United States, because every person of color is all centered there, right? So it's 80% people of color, it's 40% immigrant and refugee, and more than half the people who live there are below the poverty line. So they're driving down the major thoroughfare, and the mayor notices that there's a couple streetlights out, and he says, why are those streetlights out? And of course, the person from City Light, from the utility, is like, I'll find out, Mr. Mayor, right? But it turns out he does. And so he actually goes back, and he actually pulls together a team, because we had just introduced the use of a racial equity tool in the city. And so one of the first questions in the tool is, like, data, measured, what's happening? So they go back out, and they actually count the number of lights that are out. And it turns out there's not a couple street lights out, there's 80 street lights out, right? And I can tell you right now, you won't find anywhere else in the city of Seattle where there's 80 street lights out. So then the question became, why? So the first question, I guess, in that was just, what was the current system? So the current system, your house, your business, street light burns out, you pick up the phone, you call the city, you give the pole number, city comes out, changes the bulb, right? Why would a system that requires me to pick up the phone and call the city to tell them that a street light's out not work in a neighborhood that's 80% people of color, 40% immigrants and refugees, and more than half the folks below the poverty line? Why? They wouldn't know. Don't trust government. Don't have a phone. Language. In less than 30 seconds, we named why that system could never work. And guess what? That had always been the system. You with me? Took us 30 seconds to be like, that doesn't make any damn sense. But no, that's how we've always done it. Because the history of our country is hard baked into our policy and practice. You with me? So it turns out that there's other systems for replacing streetlights. One of the simplest is just geographic. So meaning light bulbs have a life expectancy. It's frequently written on the bulb itself, right? It turns out that if you write down the day you put it in, that you can come back and replace it, whether it's burnt out yet or not, because it's going to burn out, right? So we just went to a geographic replacement system across the city. Couple things to name in this, because it's like, yeah, that makes sense. Fix a problem. Number one thing we tell community they can do in an environmental sense for health and public safety is streetlights. Right? No question about it. Number one thing you can do in an environmental sense to help make communities safe is provide lighting. And we are providing no lighting as city government to the highest crime, most vulnerable neighborhood in the city. So then the mayor gets this and it's like, this is brilliant. So what other systems do we have that are complaint-based? And of course, government employees are like, everything's complaint-based. It's like it's how we do our work. So we change not only streetlights, but potholes, graffiti, you with me? Change everything that's a complaint-based system to actually think about how we actually going to respond to it as a proactive system. It turns out there's one system that most people don't think of as a complaint-based system that is absolutely critical, which is 911, right? It is, in fact, the quintessential complaint-based system. And for all the reasons we just named, those same outcomes occur for 911. Trust, language, access. So in Seattle, what that meant is that we got as many 911 calls from the University of Washington district as we did from this neighborhood. What were the complaints from the University of Washington? Parties, noise complaints. But not only did we get as many complaints, we then actually had a system in which the number of 911 calls dictated how many resources we put in that community. You with me? So we were spending as much money, resource, and police time to deal with noise complaints in the university district as we were in our highest crime, most vulnerable neighborhood. So we changed it. This process, which was led by, to be clear, a group of men and women who replace light bulbs, changed the entire system for the city of Seattle in complaint basis. And the beauty of it is that all of those folks got to take ownership in the nature of that change. But the change we're looking for is not just the most obvious. It's not just who's getting shot by police. It's not just who's ending up in the criminal justice system. And don't get me wrong, those are critical. It is to recognize at the same time that for most folks in those communities, it's not just that they have concerns about relationship with policing. It's that their lights aren't on. It's that their garbage isn't picked up at the same rate. It's that their water cutoff numbers are not the same. It's that their schools do not get as much resources. It is in every aspect of their life. And in fact, there's no place that we can't start in this conversation that's likely not to drive an improvement for those communities. Whether it's as small as whether our streetlights are on, or whether it's as profound as what is the nature of our relationship between the police in our community and the neighbors themselves. So I'm just going to stop. This is the piece that we name when we find solutions that work for those most vulnerable in our communities, we find solutions that work better for everyone. Streetlights, Who do you think called to thank the city for the change in that practice? It turned out it was white, middle-class homeowners on the north end. They had figured out how to make it work, right? They understood that if they were frustrated enough, they could pick up the phone and call somebody and holler at them. But it really wasn't working. They just figured a workaround. So in the end, the folks who actually thanked the city for the change in policy were actually not folks of color in the South End. It's actually white middle-class folks who were tired of calling to complain. So let me stop, open this up for a few minutes for some Q&A, and maybe do a time check with folks in the back. Any thoughts, reactions, or questions? Please. We have a mic coming to you, too. Thank you, Courtney.
Have you been at this long enough to gather any information that shows whether the longer-term goals, like health outcomes or education outcomes, are changing in the communities where you've been working?
It's a great, and I think everybody heard that. It's a great question, and the short answer is no. We can point to places where we see, it's a really hard thing for us to measure, first off. We can point to places where we can see an uptick, better outcomes. You could probably point to some examples here, even in the state of Virginia, where we've seen some better outcomes. It is hard to actually tie to that what's driving it. So we have examples that we can say, yeah, we think this correlates. We think this is actually helping. But it is really hard. There's so many things that are going into that mix, right? It's in some ways naming and inverse what I just named. So if you want to know what is driving kids' dropout rate in high school, yes, there's no question that part of that is driven by the quality of schools that they're going to. But there's also no question that discipline plays a role, housing plays a role, whether they have adequate access to health, whether they're getting adequate food. And so when you start to actually ask what's driving the uptick, it's actually a hard thing to actually correlate. But having said that, yes, there's plenty of places where, whether it's thinking about education, health, et cetera, we actually see some positive outcomes. And one of the things that we actually really stress is to keep our eyes on the prize of, like, we want to reduce the life expectancy gap based on zip code. But to be really clear about what it is we're measuring in the short term, because that is not likely to happen by the end of next year, right? So being really targeted and saying, no, well, one of the things we're going to do to that end is we're going to make sure that, that we're looking at breastfeeding, is a good example, and making sure that mothers are breastfeeding at the same rates regardless of race. And that's something that is more measurable, right? So actually tracking those things and then tying them over time to the sort of big picture outcomes is what we see as sort of best practice. It gives folks a sense of that we're making progress, and it gives us time to really track what the longer term effects are. That makes sense. Thoughts, questions in the back?
Thank you so much for the presentation. So you talked about institutional racism or discrimination or sexism or whatever it is. How about internalized oppression of oneself in reaction to that? Are there conversations about how I feel, for example, or do you know what I mean? Oh,
I totally do. Yes. This was a broad overlay, and you're naming something really important. So if we talked about just individual racism, was just naming it in its broadest sense, and really the problematic of it, which is that it's how people think about these issues without recognizing the institutional and structural implications. But if we were to break down individual, there's both individual and interpersonal in that. And at the individual level, we're both talking about, sort of, to your point, how do we all adopt messages, right? How do we adopt messages that are either promoting our own ideas of privilege and superiority, or how do we adopt messages that are actually supporting our own ideas of inferiority and of you know, what it means to actually internalize racist ideas about yourself? So we know, and you know, some great research out there on this, we know those things are very real in how people sort of internalize messages and what it means in terms of their outcomes. There's a great book, I'll just make this as, because there's no way I'm going to be able to even begin to do this justice in a few minutes, but it's Whistling Vivaldi. Amazing book. It's on stereotype threat. It's a weird title. It's so this was the book's title is based on this experience. Black man going to university in Chicago. And he finds when he's walking on campus streets in the evening or early morning that other white folks, white students, get nervous and will move away from him. Right? So he starts to try to avoid, to try to take routes that will keep him out from having this personal experience because it's causing him duress. And then one day he's walking along, he's not thinking about it, and he's whistling Vivaldi. Folks, classical music. And what he realizes is that all the white folks around him are comfortable. That makes sense? He's suddenly not a threat. He's a black man whistling classical music. Like, how threatening is that, right? So the book is about the strategies that people employ, develop, in order to deal with the pressures they feel. And those strategies cut a whole bunch of ways. So the core, just to name, the core example that they lead with is they take a group of black kids and white kids, students, and they take them golfing in a mix. And they tell the first group that golfing is an example of intellectual prowess. With me? Like, if you're a good golfer, you must be brilliant. And they tell the second group that golfing is a measurement of your physical prowess. And in the first group, the intellectual prowess, black kids underperform. And in the second group, athletic prowess, white kids underperform. So it turns out all of us are constantly taking in these ideas of who we are in relationship to each other based on our identity. And they drive in really drastic ways what our own performance looks like. So it's a really powerful book that takes that from everything from testing, which we know drives outcomes for women and kids of color, to health outcomes. And it turns out that that constant pressure, actually, no surprise, results in actually really pretty significant loss in time. Thus, 30 years difference in life expectancy, or a part of it. So that piece, I think, is critical. There's a lot there to unpack. And I think as, you know, as folks get sort of deeper into conversation, it's really important that folks make space for those discussions. And it's been in our experience that people have time to really get real about what this information, what the history of our country, what it really has meant in terms of how we internalize the ideas of who we are as individuals. Great question. Oh, two.
Hi. I am from another country, and so my view is a little bit from outside. Okay? Mm-hmm. But when you were mentioned that exactly his individual techniques that he had, that individual had to do to walk through campus, I was thinking how there's a name for that in anthropology, which is cultural techniques, when also the government can create ways to weaken an individual. Mm. So for me to see how the efforts for inclusiveness here in the US is very strange because, for example, in Brazil, we are most biracial I am. And I didn't think much about slavery while I was in Brazil, even though we did have slavery. But here, so much is speaking about that. But then I think slavery is a collective trauma. When you talk about that, you make an individual to think about that trauma again, go through that trauma again, and so weaken that identity again. So the difficulty I see in every time that we are speaking about inclusiveness is how we do that in creating really opportunities for inclusiveness for many races or many cultures without actually, by commenting on that, creating more exclusiveness, creating more things that make those cultures to think about the difficulties related to them. How do we talk about the Latin Americans without always pretend that they are all not intellectual, not educated, that they are just workers that are here illegal and not also people that can contribute to the society. And so that for me is a trick that puzzles me.
Yeah, no, I would just yes to that. I mean, I think that you're absolutely right that race plays differently in different parts of the world. It's always an important thing to name. There are some similarities and sometimes not as much. But I think you're right. In the United States, this conversation was baked into our founding as a country, right? And it's one that we have not ever really figured out how to have in a very productive way that allows us, to your point, I think, to move forward. And so I think in that way, it's why this conversation about how do we sort of normalize these conversations becomes so important. Way too often, and I would just echo what you said, way too often discussions now end up just being sort of recurring moments of trauma for folks, as opposed to folks actually really having a discussion about where we're at and how do we move forward. And but that's going to take some work. I was in Minneapolis. The mayor of St. Paul, there's a community there called Rondo, and Rondo is the historic Black community in St. Paul. And you could do this. You could just wander across the country. If you want a really interesting sort of way of thinking about a travel guide, you could just wander across the country and look for U.S. highways that have destroyed Black business districts. There's literally hundreds of them around the country. It was just standard practice, right? And so Rondo, thriving business community in St. Paul. And when the freeway came in, it initially, quote unquote, divided it in half. Within a few years, it was just gone, just dead. And so it's now like Richmond, like a lot of cities. The inner core is starting to go through a bit of expansion again. And so there's been some money that's being reinvested into Rondo. And the city did a really great job of reaching out. Still majority Black as a part of the city. And reaching out and just saying, like, what do you want here? What should we be investing in, et cetera? But the piece that the mayor did that was huge, because everybody was like, oh, this is going to be a hot mess. Because every time it comes around, it's like, here we go, the Rondo conversation, right? The mayor actually showed up, and in addition to talking about the money that was going to be invested, he offered a formal apology on behalf of the city and the history of the city. Named the harm that had been done, named what the long-term impact had been on the community, and named that it would never happen again, right? That combination of really thinking about both solution and reconciliation, I think, is the critical one if we want to figure out how we move forward from conversations. So I'll just leave it at that. And I saw one more I saw right up front. Yeah, ask, and I'll repeat. Good. How do we have that? I think everybody heard that. How do we have that conversation, the conversation with my neighbor about race in a way that keeps us moving and doesn't end up offending folks or causing more tension? One thing, we got to be better with we have to be better with with conflict. You know what I'm saying? Like it is, and it's really an odd one. I encourage everybody to think about this one. Like people will, like, you can hear folks talking about like the game last night and going at it, right? And somehow that's okay, but God forbid that I say something about race in which you and I have a slight disagreement. And I think in that way, we've got to just figure out how we just normalize this conversation. We're not always going to be in agreement about it. There is going to be some tension, right? So I think one is us recognizing that and recognizing that that's not necessarily a bad thing. Conflict does not have to be a bad thing. Second piece is, though, you got to get better at just doing it. And I would just recommend we've done 2 national rounds of research on looking at how to communicate about race and policy. And I'm a little geeky, but it's fascinating stuff. It turns out we've looked at implicit bias, going back to this question about how people internalize messages, but really looking at how people respond. And as a result of that work, we've created a toolkit that is basically on how to effectively message on race. And I would invite you, would encourage anybody who's interested to check it out. I think it can be a helpful tool. The core of it is that beyond just sort of thinking about maybe how I would shape my message, practice, right? I mean, there's no secret to this. I wish there was, but it is practice. It's, you know, the story I was trying to give is that I can tell you now that in Seattle, in Dane County in Wisconsin, that you can walk through City Hall and you can be like, institutional racism, and nobody blinks an eye. They may be like, what are you talking about? But ain't nobody running in circles. Nobody starts crying, right? You know what I mean? That space of figuring out how we normalize that space is practice. It is simply having that conversation with your friend, with your neighbor, with your boss, with whoever is in your life, to just keep building that. We were talking about it in the trustees. It's building a muscle. That's all it is. And there's, to your point, it's worth thinking through. So we have a tool. There's other tools online. Opportunity Agenda does a tool. So if you're looking for, like, how might I frame this up the first time I do it? Absolutely. But my best advice is just practice. I will say, you know, in this moment, we worry a lot. And we're in a contentious moment nationally. I mean, there's no question. We have all the historic tensions that we all have locally. But I wanted just to end on this story, which is that I think we have to get away from thinking about whether we're winning, whether we're most effective, and shift to a different way of thinking. I had the opportunity in 2001 to go to South Africa and work with a series of cities and villages on the issue of governmental trust. So South Africa, apartheid falls, Mandela comes in as president. Some of the folks in this room are old enough to remember this. It was an exciting time. This is 6 years after Mandela had come into office. And the government, right, was still trying to figure out how to get community to trust government. Right? Apartheid's gone. The elected officials look like the people who voted for them. The government staff have rolled over this. Now, there's people who look like you are now running and owning government. And people are still like, nah, don't trust them. Right? Because it turns out once you damage that trust, it takes a lot to rebuild it. So the question was, what are ways that we can rebuild that trust between government and community? And so I went there, and in a classic fashion, like you go someplace thinking, here I am, I'm here to share. Talk about getting schooled, right? So in Port Elizabeth, meet this brother, Kusa Jack. And Kusa was the head of the Port Elizabeth economic boycott, student-led. So at the fall of apartheid, what happens is all this pressure, but it's actually a whole bunch of youth get together and say, we're not spending a dime in Port Elizabeth. And Port Elizabeth is one of the largest cities in South Africa. And it breaks the back of the apartheid regime. Turns out that you can't have 90% of your population not spending money on your business. So apartheid falls, and Kusa's like, I just want to go to school. So he goes off to London and he gets a degree in business, and then he comes back and he's like, I want to start a construction business. So while he is leading these student boycotts in Port Elizabeth, he's detained repeatedly by the police for weeks at a time, tortured, had his fingernails torn out, beaten, right? But now he's back and he's like, I'm just building my country. And at the time, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission is getting going. For folks who don't know, it's a pretty simple process. They knew that there was a ton of those kind of crimes that were committed. Torture, abuse, etc. And they were like, the only way we're going to be able to move forward is if we're clear we're not going to arrest everybody who did this, but we're going to ask that you step forward, admit what you have done, and if you do, we will forgive you. Powerful concept. Sad part is that most folks wouldn't even step forward to admit what they had done. But it turns out that the head of the police force in Port Elizabeth was one of the few high-level public officials who stepped up and confessed all. Tortured people, beat them, jailed them illegally. And in doing so, his wife left him. Family literally disowned him, lost his work. And Kusa hears this, calls him, and says, come work for me. And I was like, when I heard this, I was like, you asked the man who tortured you to come work with you? Like, yeah. Every Sunday, this former police chief who tortured him and his new family, and Kusa and his family, sit down for dinner, and then on Monday, they go to work together. And I said to him, I said, I'm being honest. And so as we think about what it means to be committed to equity, it's that. What is the world we want to live in? How do we do that? And I just want to say thank you all for taking the time to be here tonight. And so excited about your journey forward. So thanks.